The smallest decision you make on the worst day of your life may become the reason someone else never forgets your name. Naomi Brooks tightened her grip on the worn leather folder tucked beneath her arm as the cold April rain soaked through the sleeves of her thrift store blazer. By the time she reached the polished entrance of Ellison Tower Residences, she was exactly 11 minutes late. 11 minutes. Long enough to lose a job before the interview even began. Her phone buzzed again inside her pocket. Another message from Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly neighbor watching 6-year-old Ethan while Naomi chased what felt like her final chance. His fever's down a little. He's sleeping now. Don't worry about him. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second. Worrying was all she had done for the last 3 years. Worry about rent. Worry about groceries. Worry about the electricity bill folded inside her kitchen drawer with the bright red reminder stamped across the envelope. Worry about making sure Ethan never noticed she skipped dinner twice this week so he could have enough to eat. She whispered a quiet thank you under her breath before stepping into the marble lobby where everything gleamed beneath warm golden lights. Even the silence inside the building felt expensive. A concierge dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit glanced toward her dripping umbrella before checking a tablet. "Ms. Brooks." Naomi nodded, embarrassed by the rainwater gathering beneath her shoes. "Mr. Ellison is expecting you. Penthouse 72. She blinked. Penthouse. The email had mentioned a private interview, but never explained why it wasn't taking place at corporate headquarters. The elevator climbed so smoothly, she barely noticed the movement. As the city disappeared beneath her feet, she quietly rehearsed the answers she'd repeated all morning. Tell him about warehouse operations. Mention inventory management. Don't sound desperate. Don't mention the eviction notice unless he asks. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Beyond them, gray clouds stretched across the skyline, while rain traced long silver lines down the glass. A house manager greeted her with a polite smile. "Mr. Ellison had to step away for a business call. He'll be with you shortly." Naomi apologized immediately. "I'm sorry I'm late." The older woman simply nodded. "Please have a seat." The apartment was unlike anything Naomi had ever seen. Minimalist furniture, dark walnut floors, modern artwork. Everything looked perfectly arranged, almost untouched. Yet one sound refused to belong there. Drip, drip, drip. Naomi glanced toward the kitchen. Another drop splashed into a stainless steel sink. Then another. Tiny, steady, impossible to ignore. She tried focusing on the framed awards displayed across one wall instead. Drip, drip, drip. The faucet leaked with relentless rhythm. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The house manager noticed her looking. "Maintenance is coming tomorrow." Naomi nodded politely. Another drop echoed through the quiet apartment. It wasn't just the sound. It was the waste. Every few seconds another drop disappeared down the drain. Water her grandmother used to remind her never to waste because every dollar counted somewhere. Naomi stood almost without thinking. "Would it be all right if I looked at it?" The woman seemed surprised. "You know plumbing?" Naomi smiled faintly. "A little. My dad repaired apartments before he passed away. He taught me enough to stop small leaks." The manager hesitated. "I'd rather you didn't." Naomi nodded and stepped back immediately. "Of course." She returned to her chair. 10 silent seconds passed. Drip, drip, drip. Finally, the house manager sighed. "If you're absolutely certain you know what you're doing." "The toolbox is under the sink." Naomi crouched beside the cabinet, finding an old adjustable wrench and a small screwdriver. She rolled up her sleeves, carefully inspecting the faucet. The rubber washer inside had worn unevenly. A simple adjustment slowed the leak. Another careful turn. Silence. She waited several seconds. Nothing. Not another drop. She smiled to herself, wiping her damp hands with a paper towel before placing every tool exactly where she had found it. "There," she whispered almost apologetically. "That should hold until someone replaces the washer." "If you had broken it," a calm voice said behind her, "what would you have done?" Naomi slowly turned. Standing near the hallway entrance was Marcus Ellison. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit. His expression revealed almost nothing except quiet observation. The house manager froze. Naomi stood immediately. "I'm sorry. I should have asked again." Marcus didn't move. His steel-gray eyes rested on the perfectly still faucet before returning to her face. "You touched something that wasn't yours." Naomi lowered her gaze for only a moment before meeting his eyes again. Yes. Why? She glanced toward the sink. Because pretending I didn't see the problem would have been easier. Marcus waited. Naomi continued softly. But easier isn't always the same thing as right. Neither of them spoke. Somewhere beyond the enormous windows, thunder rolled over Manhattan while the apartment remained perfectly silent. Marcus looked once more at the faucet that no longer leaked. Then back at the woman standing in soaked shoes with rain still clinging to the edge of her jacket. Finally, he asked a question Naomi never expected to hear. Ms. Brooks, before we discuss your resume, tell me why fixing a stranger's faucet seemed more important than saving your own interview. Naomi let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. Marcus Ellison's question lingered in the quiet apartment, carrying no anger, only genuine curiosity. She glanced once more at the motionless faucet before answering. Because if I had ignored it, I would have spent the entire interview listening to that leak instead of listening to you. A faint crease appeared between Marcus's eyebrows. You believe the faucet mattered more than making a good first impression? Naomi offered a small, almost embarrassed smile. No, sir. I believe doing the right thing was part of making a good first impression. The house manager quietly excused herself, sensing that the room no longer belonged to anyone except the two strangers standing a few feet apart. Marcus motioned toward the dining table overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Please, sit down. Naomi carefully took her seat, placing her worn leather folder on the polished table. She noticed that Marcus never opened it. Instead, he folded his hands together and studied her with the same calm attention he had given the repaired faucet. According to your application, he said, you spent 6 years managing warehouse logistics before leaving the workforce for nearly 3 years. Naomi nodded. Yes. Why? She hesitated, not because she wanted to hide the truth, but because explaining her life had become exhausting. My son was born 6 weeks early. He needed constant medical appointments. Childcare cost more than my paycheck. Something had to give. Marcus simply nodded. There was no sympathy in his expression, only quiet acknowledgement. And now he is 6 years old. Her voice softened. He still gets sick more often than most children, but he loves school, dinosaurs, pancakes on Saturday mornings, and pretending every cardboard box is a spaceship. For the first time, the corner of Marcus's mouth moved ever so slightly. An ambitious engineer already. Naomi laughed softly before catching herself. The sound surprised even her. It had been weeks since she had laughed without forcing it. Marcus noticed. You were nervous when you arrived. I was 11 minutes late. Actually, Marcus replied, checking the watch on his wrist. You arrived 10 minutes and 52 seconds late. Naomi smiled despite herself. That somehow sounds worse. It usually does. Silence settled between them again, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. Rain continued sliding across the massive windows behind Marcus, turning the city into a watercolor of silver and gray. Finally, he reached for her resume, though he barely glanced at it. You listed 3 references. Yes. I have already spoken to all 3. Naomi blinked. Already. Last night. Her stomach tightened. Then you know I left my last position unexpectedly. Marcus leaned back slightly. Your former supervisor said you solved problems nobody else noticed. Naomi looked down at her folded hands. He also said I asked too many questions. He did. Marcus's voice remained perfectly even. He described you as inconvenient. Naomi gave a quiet nod. That sounds about right. Do you enjoy being inconvenient? She thought about the question before answering. No, but I dislike watching preventable problems become expensive disasters. Marcus's eyes remained fixed on hers. Interesting. He stood and walked toward the kitchen. Naomi watched him turn the faucet on full force before shutting it off again. Not a single drop escaped. He stood there for several seconds, almost studying the silence. Do you know why I scheduled this interview here instead of my office? Naomi shook her head. No, sir. Because people behave differently when they believe they are outside the formal interview. He turned to face her. Some spend 20 minutes admiring the artwork. Some photograph the skyline when they think nobody is looking. One applicant spent 12 minutes searching for my wine collection. Naomi felt heat rise into her cheeks. Marcus continued. You were the first person who noticed something broken before asking what the job paid. Naomi lowered her eyes. I still need the job. I know. He returned to the table and closed her resume, without asking another question about degrees, certifications, or software experience. Instead, he opened a slim black notebook. I am not offering you the position you applied for. Naomi's heartbeat slowed with disappointment. She had expected as much the moment she arrived late. Marcus continued before she could respond. Instead, I am offering you a 3-day contract. She looked up, confused. Doing what? Watching. Watching what? Everything. Marcus's expression remained unreadable. For the next 3 days you will move through my company without a title, without authority, and without anyone knowing why you are there. I want you to tell me what everyone else has stopped seeing. Naomi stared at him, uncertain whether she had misunderstood. You want me to inspect your company? No. Marcus picked up the small adjustable wrench she had returned to the toolbox earlier and placed it gently on the table between them. I want you to tell me where the leaks are. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, but inside the apartment Naomi realized this interview had never been about her resume at all. It had begun the moment she heard a single drop of water echo through a room where everyone else had learned to ignore the sound. Naomi barely remembered the subway ride back to Queens. The city outside, the train windows blurred into streaks of steel and rain as Marcus Ellison's final words echoed through her mind. Tell me where the leaks are. It sounded less like a temporary assignment and more like a question someone had been trying to answer for years. By the time she unlocked the door to her small second-floor apartment, the familiar smell of chicken soup greeted her. Mrs. Jenkins looked up from the tiny kitchen with a warm smile. Your little astronaut is awake. Ethan appeared moments later wrapped in his favorite blue blanket decorated with faded rockets. His curls were slightly flattened from sleep, and his cheeks still carried the pink tint of a lingering fever. The moment he saw Naomi, his tired eyes brightened. Mom! He ran into her arms with surprising energy. Naomi hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of soap and crayons that somehow made every difficult day feel worth surviving. Did you get the job? He asked with complete confidence, as though failure had never crossed his mind. Naomi smiled softly while brushing a curl away from his forehead. Not exactly. Ethan frowned. Is that bad? She kissed the top of his head. I do not know yet. Later that evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep with a dinosaur book open across his chest, Naomi sat alone at the tiny kitchen table, studying the envelope Marcus's assistant had handed her before she left the penthouse. Inside was a temporary employee badge, a parking voucher she would never use because she did not own a car, and a handwritten note in neat black ink. Report to Ellison Holdings. 7:30 tomorrow morning. Observe. Listen. Say nothing until the end of each day. She turned the note over. Nothing else had been written. No job title. No department. No explanation. Her phone buzzed just as she folded the paper back into the envelope. It was another message from her landlord reminding her that rent was already 9 days overdue. If payment was not received by Friday, additional legal action would begin. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment before placing the phone face down. Friday. 3 days away. 3 days to prove herself. 3 days before losing the apartment Ethan called home. The next morning the sun finally broke through the clouds, reflecting off the mirrored glass of Ellison Holdings headquarters. The 48-story building stood above the surrounding streets with quiet confidence rather than unnecessary extravagance. Employees flowed through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups, laptops, and conversations about deadlines. Naomi adjusted the borrowed blazer she had carefully pressed the night before and stepped inside. The receptionist greeted her politely before handing her a visitor pass instead of an employee badge. Mr. Ellison requested this specifically, she explained. Naomi noticed several curious glances from nearby employees, but asked no questions. She remembered the instructions. Observe. Listen. Say nothing. Within minutes, she found herself following an executive assistant named Claire through multiple departments. Claire smiled often, but rarely slowed her pace. Marketing is on 21. Accounting is on 24. Operations is on 28. Human resources is on 30. If anyone asks, you are shadowing executive leadership. Naomi nodded quietly while absorbing everything around her. On the 21st floor, she noticed 3 designers waiting nearly 15 minutes for approval from a manager who never arrived because he was trapped in another meeting discussing the same project. On the 24th floor, she overheard 2 accountants apologizing for entering identical data into different systems because neither department trusted the other's numbers. On the 28th floor, a warehouse supervisor waited almost an hour for signatures that could have been approved electronically in less than 2 minutes. Nobody complained loudly. They simply accepted the delays the way people eventually stopped hearing a dripping faucet. Shortly before noon, Claire excused herself for another meeting, leaving Naomi alone near the employee cafe. She carried only a notebook filled with quiet observations when she noticed a janitor struggling to push an overloaded supply cart across a section of carpet where one wheel had become stuck. Dozens of employees walked around him without breaking stride. Naomi immediately stepped forward. "May I help?" The older man looked surprised before smiling gratefully. Together they lifted the front of the cart over the uneven edge of the carpet. "Thank you," he said. "Most people do not even see me anymore." Naomi smiled gently. Sometimes people get so busy reaching the next floor that they stop noticing what keeps the building standing. Unbeknownst to her, high above the lobby, Marcus Ellison stood inside the glass walls of his office watching security footage on a silent monitor. He was not watching quarterly reports or stock prices. He was watching a woman who had once stopped to repair a leaking faucet and who now seemed unable to walk past any problem, no matter how small, without trying to make someone else's day a little easier. The first day ended without a single instruction from Marcus Ellison. At precisely 5:30, Claire returned to the employee cafe carrying a slim envelope. "Mr. Ellison asked me to remind you that your observations should remain confidential until tomorrow morning." Naomi accepted the envelope with a polite nod. Inside was a meal voucher, a subway pass, and one handwritten sentence in the same neat black ink. "What people ignore tells you more than what they celebrate." She folded the note carefully before slipping it into her folder. That evening, Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, building an imaginary space station from empty cereal boxes and masking tape. "This one is mission control," he announced proudly. "And this one fixes broken satellites." Naomi smiled as she knelt beside him. "Who fixes mission control?" Ethan looked at her as though the answer were obvious. "Everybody does a little bit." His simple words lingered in her thoughts long after he had gone to bed. Early the next morning, she returned to Ellison Holdings before sunrise. The lobby buzzed with quiet energy as security officers greeted employees by name, and fresh coffee filled the air with its rich aroma. Claire met her near the elevators. "Mr. Ellison would like your first report before the executive meeting." Naomi followed her into a conference room lined with glass walls overlooking the city. Marcus stood alone near the windows, reading through a stack of reports. Without looking up, he asked, "What did you learn yesterday?" Naomi hesitated. "Do you want the polite version or the honest one?" Marcus placed the papers on the table. "The honest one is usually more useful." Naomi opened her notebook. "Everyone here works hard. That is not the problem." Marcus folded his arms. "Go on. Departments spend too much time protecting themselves from each other. Accounting does not trust operations. Operations does not trust purchasing. Managers wait for approvals because they are afraid of making decisions. People measure productivity by meetings instead of results." Marcus remained silent, encouraging her to continue. "The company does not have one big leak," Naomi said quietly. "It has hundreds of small ones. Alone they seem harmless. Together they waste thousands of hours every month." For several seconds the room remained perfectly still. Marcus glanced toward the notebook in her hands. "Did anyone tell you where to look?" "No." "Did anyone complain to you?" "Not directly." Marcus nodded once. "Interesting." Before either of them could speak again, the conference room doors opened. 6 senior executives entered carrying tablets and coffee cups, immediately filling the room with conversation. The moment they noticed Naomi, several voices fell silent. A tall man with silver-framed glasses stopped beside Marcus. "Good morning." His eyes shifted toward Naomi. "I was not aware we had another consultant joining us." Marcus answered calmly. "She is here at my request." The executive extended a polite but restrained smile toward Naomi. "Richard Collins, Chief Operations Officer." Naomi introduced herself. Richard's expression barely changed. "I hope your visit proves enlightening." His choice of words sounded courteous, yet something beneath them carried quiet skepticism. As the meeting began, Naomi took a seat near the back of the room exactly as instructed. Charts appeared across large presentation screens showing rising revenue, expanding market share, and record quarterly profits. Every graph pointed upward, Every department reported success. Every executive spoke confidently about efficiency and growth. Yet as Naomi listened carefully, another pattern emerged. The same shipment delays appeared in 3 separate presentations under different names. Customer complaints were described as isolated incidents despite appearing across multiple regions. Hiring shortages were blamed on labor markets instead of internal turnover. Everyone described symptoms. Nobody discussed causes. Marcus remained unusually quiet throughout the meeting, asking only occasional questions. When the final presentation ended, Richard Collins smiled confidently. Overall, I believe we are operating at peak performance. Marcus slowly turned toward Naomi. Ms. Brooks. The room instantly fell silent. Richard frowned slightly. Marcus continued in the same calm voice. You have spent less than 24 hours inside this company. Naomi immediately felt every pair of eyes settle on her. Yes, sir. Marcus nodded toward the presentation screen. Tell us what we missed. A ripple of surprise spread across the conference table. Richard's polite smile disappeared almost instantly. Naomi looked down at her notebook, then back at the executives who had spent years building careers inside these walls. She understood that whatever she said next would determine far more than a 3-day contract. Somewhere beneath the polished reports and carefully rehearsed presentations, she could already hear another faucet beginning to drip, and this time the entire room was pretending not to notice. Naomi could feel the weight of every eye in the room before she spoke a single word. She looked down at the pages of handwritten notes she had filled during the previous day, then quietly closed the notebook instead. I think the reports are accurate, she began. Several executives exchanged satisfied glances. Richard Collins leaned back in his chair, his confidence returning. Then Naomi continued. I also think they are incomplete. The room fell silent again. Marcus remained expressionless. Explain. Naomi walked toward the large presentation screen without touching the remote. Yesterday I watched 3 departments solve the same problem 3 different ways because they do not trust each other's information. Each team believes it is protecting the company, but together they are slowing it down. She turned toward the accounting director. Your team spends hours verifying inventory numbers that operations already confirmed. The woman blinked in surprise. Naomi looked toward Richard. Operations waits for purchasing approvals because managers are afraid of making decisions without signatures. Finally, she faced the human resources vice president. Meanwhile, new employees wait weeks for access to software because nobody owns the entire onboarding process. Nobody interrupted her. They simply stared. Naomi spoke carefully, never raising her voice. None of these problems appeared dangerous alone. That is why they survive. Small leaks rarely flood a building overnight. They waste resources one drop at a time until everyone accepts the loss as normal. Richard folded his hands together. With respect, Ms. Brooks, you have been inside this company for less than 2 days. Yes. You cannot possibly understand the complexity of a business this size. Naomi nodded. You are right. I do not understand everything. Richard smiled faintly. Then perhaps we should leave strategic decisions to people with more experience. Before Naomi could answer, Marcus asked a simple question. Richard, how many cross-department approval forms require more than 4 signatures? Richard hesitated only briefly. Approximately 100. Marcus turned toward the chief financial officer. How many required that many signatures 5 years ago? The executive opened a report before answering quietly. 32. Marcus looked back at Richard. Did our company become 3 times more complicated, or did we become 3 times more afraid? No one answered. The meeting ended several minutes later with unusual silence replacing the confident conversations that had filled the room earlier. As executives gathered their tablets, Naomi quietly returned to her seat, convinced she had just guaranteed the end of her temporary assignment. Instead, Marcus approached her after everyone else had left. Walk with me. They stepped into the hallway overlooking the city. Employees hurried past carrying laptops and coffee cups, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding beside them. Marcus stopped near the windows. Do you know why Richard reacted the way he did? Naomi shook her head. Because I embarrassed him? Marcus looked down at the busy streets nearly 40 stories below. No, because you threatened something more valuable than his reputation. Naomi waited. Certainty, Marcus replied. People build careers around believing their systems work. The The moment someone questions those systems, they often defend them before they examine them. Naomi thought about her years working in warehouses where small suggestions were often ignored until they became emergencies. I was not trying to prove anyone wrong. Marcus nodded. I know. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a new employee badge. Unlike the temporary visitor pass she had worn since yesterday, this one carried full building access. Your assignment has changed. Naomi looked at the badge, confused. I thought I only had 3 days. You still do. Marcus's voice remained calm. But beginning this afternoon, you will no longer observe from the outside. What will I be doing? You will spend the rest of the trial inside operations. Naomi looked up. Working with Richard? Working under Richard. She hesitated. After this morning, I doubt he wants me anywhere near his department. A faint smile crossed Marcus's face. Exactly. Before Naomi could ask another question, Claire hurried down the hallway carrying a tablet. Mr. Ellison, the board has confirmed Friday's emergency strategy session. Marcus accepted the tablet without taking his eyes off Naomi. Good. Claire lowered her voice. The directors expect measurable progress before then. Marcus simply nodded. After Claire disappeared around the corner, Naomi looked at him with quiet confusion. Friday. Marcus turned toward the elevator. The board believes our operational delays are beginning to affect future contracts. They expect solutions in 48 hours. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. 48 hours. The same deadline printed across her landlord's notice waiting on the kitchen table at home. Marcus pressed the elevator button before speaking one final time. You told me this company has hundreds of small leaks. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Now we have 2 days to prove they can be fixed before people start tearing down the whole building instead. Richard Collins did not bother hiding his disappointment when Naomi arrived on the operations floor that afternoon. He glanced at the new employee badge clipped to her blazer before setting a thick stack of reports on an empty desk near the back of the department. If you are here to observe, stay out of the way, he said evenly. If you are here to contribute, start by understanding how complicated this business actually is. Naomi accepted the reports with a polite smile. Thank you. Richard raised an eyebrow, perhaps expecting an argument, but none came. He walked away without another word. For the next several hours, Naomi read shipment schedules, vendor agreements, inventory summaries, and approval logs. She said very little. Instead, she highlighted repeated delays that appeared under different project names and quietly sketched a simple flowchart on a yellow legal pad. Every delay seemed to begin with the same problem. Nobody owned the entire process. Each department completed its own task efficiently, then waited for someone else. Responsibility moved. Accountability disappeared. Late that afternoon, she walked through one of the company's distribution centers with a warehouse supervisor named Luis Ramirez. Unlike the executives upstairs, Luis spoke plainly. We lose half a day every week waiting for signatures that everybody already knows are coming. He pointed towards several loaded pallets sitting near the shipping dock. Those trucks should have left this morning. Naomi studied the paperwork clipped to each shipment. Every document carried identical information, yet each required approval from 4 separate managers working in different buildings. How long has it been this way? She asked. Luis shrugged. Long enough that people stopped asking why. Naomi smiled sadly. She had heard that answer before. Back upstairs, she transferred her notes into a clean report for Marcus. She did not criticize anyone. She simply traced each unnecessary delay from beginning to end, connecting departments with careful arrows until the pattern became impossible to ignore. By early evening, she placed the completed report inside a sealed envelope addressed to the chief executive officer. As she stepped into the elevator, her phone vibrated. Mrs. Jenkins was calling. Naomi answered immediately. Is Ethan all right? The older woman's voice remained calm, but concerned. His fever came back after school. The clinic wants him checked again tonight. Naomi thanked her and hurried toward the subway. During the entire ride home, she stared at the ceiling of the train, silently calculating the remaining balance in her checking account. The urgent care visit would mean postponing another utility payment. There simply was not enough money left for both. Ethan tried to smile when she arrived, but his eyes looked tired. He reached for her hand as they sat together in the waiting room under bright fluorescent lights. Did you fix the company today? He asked quietly. Naomi squeezed his fingers. Not yet. He nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Big things take longer. His simple confidence nearly brought tears to her eyes. Shortly after 9 o'clock that night, while Ethan slept peacefully beside her on the couch after receiving medication, Naomi's phone lit up again. The caller identification displayed Claire's name. Ms. Brooks, Claire said carefully. Mr. Ellison asked me to inform you that tomorrow morning's operations presentation has been canceled. Naomi frowned. Canceled? There was a brief pause. Your report was submitted anonymously to the board before Mr. Ellison had the opportunity to review it. Naomi sat upright. What? Someone altered the cover page and removed your supporting notes. The report now appears incomplete and unsupported. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. Who has seen it? Every board member. Claire lowered her voice even further. Several directors believe inaccurate operational conclusions were circulated without authorization. Naomi closed her eyes. She suddenly understood exactly what had happened. The report had not simply been leaked. It had been stripped of the evidence that explained every conclusion. Without the supporting documents, it looked reckless instead of careful. What happens now? She asked softly. Claire hesitated before answering. There will be an internal review first thing tomorrow morning. The call ended, leaving only silence inside the apartment. Naomi looked toward the folder resting on the kitchen table. Her handwritten notes were gone. She remembered placing them inside the envelope before leaving the office. Someone had opened it after she submitted it. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the apartment window once again. Naomi listened to the familiar rhythm and thought about the first faucet she had repaired only 2 days earlier. Small leaks never stayed small when someone deliberately made them worse. And for the first time since meeting Marcus Ellison, she realized the greatest leak inside the company was not hidden inside a broken system. It was hidden inside a person. Naomi arrived at Ellison Holdings before sunrise, carrying the same worn leather folder that suddenly felt much lighter without the missing notes she knew she had written. The lobby buzzed with its usual rhythm, but this morning every greeting seemed quieter. Every glance lingered a second longer. News traveled quickly inside large companies, especially when it involved the chief executive officer and an outsider. Claire met her near the security desk, her expression unusually serious. The review starts in 15 minutes. Naomi nodded. Has Mr. Ellison seen the original report? Claire sighed softly. He has only seen what the board received. They entered the executive floor in silence. Inside the conference room, board members were already taking their seats while Richard Collins calmly organized a stack of printed documents. He looked composed, almost relieved. Marcus stood near the windows overlooking Manhattan, his posture as steady as ever, though the dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he had slept very little. When Naomi entered, he acknowledged her with a brief nod but said nothing. The meeting began with one of the directors placing the altered report on the polished table. Ms. Brooks, the chairman said evenly, these recommendations accuse multiple departments of systemic failure, yet the supporting documentation is missing. Can you explain? Naomi looked directly at the report. Every conclusion remained exactly as she had written it. Every piece of evidence had disappeared. She answered honestly. The supporting documents were attached when I submitted the report yesterday evening. Richard folded his hands. Respectfully, no one else remembers seeing those attachments. Naomi turned toward him without raising her voice. Did you personally receive the envelope? No. Who did? Richard paused for the briefest moment. Executive Administration. Claire immediately spoke. I logged the envelope at 5:12 yesterday afternoon. It was sealed. Several board members exchanged curious looks. Marcus finally asked his first question. Who handled the envelope after that? Claire opened her tablet. According to our document tracking system, the envelope was delivered to operations at 5:26 for preliminary routing before reaching your office. Richard frowned. That is standard procedure. Marcus remained calm. Continue. Claire hesitated as she scrolled through the digital log. There is something unusual. The room grew quiet. The envelope was signed into operations twice. Richard looked genuinely surprised. Twice. Claire nodded slowly. The first signature belongs to an administrative assistant at 5:26. The second electronic access occurred at 5:41 using an executive override. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Whose credentials? Claire looked at the screen again before answering carefully. The system only identifies an executive access card. The username has been removed. Richard immediately spoke. Probably a software error. Naomi remained silent, but something inside her mind suddenly connected. She remembered the operations floor. Every executive badge automatically logged entries into secured document rooms. Every badge except temporary visitor passes. Marcus turned toward the information technology director seated near the end of the table. Can executive identities simply disappear from security records? The director shook his head immediately. No. Access names cannot be deleted. Only administrators can hide them during internal investigations. Who authorized the concealment? Marcus asked. The director looked uncomfortable. I did not receive any request. The room fell silent once again. Naomi looked down at the altered report before another memory surfaced. The previous afternoon, after sealing her envelope, she had placed one small yellow sticky note on the front with 3 handwritten words. Original notes attached. She looked back up. May I ask a question? The chairman nodded. Go ahead. Naomi turned toward Claire. When you logged the envelope yesterday, did it still have my yellow note attached? Claire blinked in surprise. No, there was no note. Naomi slowly exhaled. Then someone opened it before it ever reached Mr. Ellison. Richard leaned forward. That is speculation. No, Naomi answered quietly. It is process. She met his eyes without hostility. People who tamper with reports usually remove evidence. People who simply forward reports do not stop to peel off reminder notes. Marcus looked thoughtfully at Naomi before speaking. Yesterday you told me companies fail because people ignore small leaks. Naomi nodded. Marcus looked around the conference room. Today someone spent considerable effort hiding one. At that exact moment the conference room doors opened. A nervous young administrative assistant stepped inside, carrying a thin manila folder. I am sorry to interrupt, she said, almost breathless. I was cleaning the operations archive room this morning. She held up the folder with trembling hands. I found these inside the recycling cabinet behind the shred bins. Naomi recognized the papers instantly. They were her handwritten notes, complete with every diagram, every arrow, every piece of supporting evidence she had spent hours preparing. Across the top page, the yellow sticky note was still attached. The conference room remained perfectly silent as the young administrative assistant placed the recovered folder on the polished table. Naomi recognized every page immediately. The hand-drawn workflow diagrams, the highlighted approval chains, even the small coffee stain near the bottom corner of page 3 where she had accidentally rested her paper cup the night before. Nothing had been fabricated. Nothing had been exaggerated. The evidence had simply been hidden. Marcus slowly opened the folder without speaking. One by one, he turned the pages, studying every handwritten observation with the same quiet focus Naomi had first seen when he examined the repaired faucet in his apartment. The board members leaned forward as charts connected departments through unnecessary approvals, duplicated reports, and repeated delays. Every conclusion now had a clear source. Every recommendation followed naturally from documented facts. After several long moments, Marcus looked toward the administrative assistant. Where exactly did you find these? She swallowed nervously. Inside a recycling cabinet beside the secure document room in operations. They were tucked underneath empty folders. I almost threw everything away before I noticed the handwriting. Marcus nodded once. Thank you. You did the right thing. She quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Richard Collins remained composed, but the confidence that had defined him all morning had begun to fade. Finding misplaced notes does not prove misconduct, he said carefully. Documents can be misplaced for many reasons. Marcus did not argue. Instead, he pressed a small button on the conference room table. Claire, would you join us, please? Within seconds, she entered carrying another tablet. Marcus looked at her calmly. Yesterday afternoon, after Ms. Brooks submitted her report, I asked security to preserve all camera recordings from the executive document corridor. I had a feeling we might need them. Richard's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Claire connected the tablet to the large presentation screen. Grainy security footage appeared with a timestamp matching the previous evening. Employees passed through the hallway carrying laptops and briefcases. At 5:26, an administrative assistant placed Naomi's sealed envelope inside the secure routing cabinet exactly as Claire had described. 15 minutes later, another figure entered using an executive access badge. The video contained no sound, but the image was unmistakable. The individual removed Naomi's envelope, opened it, separated several handwritten pages, resealed the remaining documents, and returned the envelope to the cabinet. Marcus paused the recording. The room remained silent. Richard stared at the frozen image without speaking. One board member quietly removed his glasses. Another slowly closed his notebook. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Richard." His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "Would you like to explain what we are looking at?" Richard lowered his eyes before answering. "I believe the report would damage confidence in the company before the board meeting." Marcus waited. Richard continued quietly. "The conclusions were correct. Several people looked at him in surprise. But I believed releasing them now would create unnecessary panic. We were already preparing our own operational review." Naomi listened without anger. She heard fear instead. The fear of someone who had spent years protecting systems until protecting the systems became more important than fixing them. Marcus folded his hands. "You removed the evidence." Richard nodded slowly. "Yes." "You allowed an employee to appear dishonest." Another pause. "Yes." Marcus looked toward the board members before speaking again. "This is exactly what Ms. Brooks described on her first day. People no longer solve problems. They manage appearances." Nobody disagreed. Marcus stood and walked toward the large presentation screen displaying Naomi's handwritten diagrams. "For years we invested millions in technology, consultants, and efficiency programs." He turned back toward the room. None of them noticed what a temporary employee noticed in less than 48 hours because she was willing to look where everyone else had stopped looking. He picked up Naomi's yellow legal pad and handed it back to her. "Ms. Brooks." Naomi looked up. "Yes, sir." "Your assignment is complete." Her heart sank for the briefest moment. Then Marcus smiled for the first time since she had met him. It was not a broad smile. It was quiet, genuine, and impossible to mistake. "Because beginning today, this is no longer a temporary assignment." He turned toward the board. "Effective immediately, I am creating an operational renewal task force reporting directly to my office." He looked back at Naomi. "I would like you to lead it." Naomi stared at him in disbelief. I do not think I am qualified." Marcus gently shook his head. "You repaired a faucet that everyone else had learned to ignore. Then you showed an entire company that the same thing was happening inside our walls." His voice softened. "Skills can be taught. Integrity cannot." Around the conference table, one by one, the board members began quietly nodding their agreement. While outside the conference room, hundreds of employees continued their ordinary work, completely unaware that, at that very moment, the first real repair inside Ellison Holdings had finally begun. 1 year later, the morning sunlight poured through the glass walls of Ellison Holdings in a way that made the entire building feel different. It was not brighter because the windows had changed. It was brighter because the people inside had. The long approval chains that once delayed every shipment had been reduced to simple, accountable decisions. Departments that had once guarded information now shared it before problems had the chance to grow. Employee turnover had fallen. Customer satisfaction had reached its highest level in nearly a decade. None of it had happened overnight. Every improvement had taken hundreds of conversations, difficult meetings, patient listening, and countless small corrections that rarely made headlines. Naomi Brooks never claimed she transformed the company alone. She simply refused to walk past problems that everyone else had accepted. Her office overlooked the same Manhattan skyline Marcus had once watched in silence, yet it looked very different through her eyes. On one wall hung framed photographs from the company's new apprenticeship program for single parents returning to the workforce. Another wall displayed handwritten thank you cards from employees whose ideas had finally been heard after years of being ignored. The expensive artwork remained elsewhere in the building. Naomi preferred reminders of people. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Ethan stepped inside wearing a small backpack that looked far too big for his 7-year-old shoulders. "Mom, Mr. Ellison said I could show you my science project." He proudly lifted a cardboard model of a water filtration system built from recycled bottles and plastic tubing. Naomi laughed warmly. "That is incredible." Ethan grinned. "Water is too important to waste." Before Naomi could answer, Marcus appeared at the doorway carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate instead of coffee. I thought engineers worked better with refreshments, he said, handing one cup to Ethan. The little boy smiled. Thank you, Mr. Ellison. Marcus crouched beside the model, studying it with genuine interest. Explain it to me. Ethan eagerly described every tube, every filter, every drop of clean water flowing through his project. Marcus listened without interrupting, asking thoughtful questions exactly the way he had listened to Naomi during their first interview. When Ethan finished, Marcus nodded with quiet admiration. Your mother once taught me something about leaks. Ethan looked at Naomi. She fixes everything. Naomi laughed softly. Not everything. Marcus smiled. More than she realizes. Later that afternoon, after Ethan left with Mrs. Jenkins to celebrate his school project, Marcus invited Naomi to his apartment for one final meeting before the company's annual leadership dinner. As she stepped inside the familiar penthouse, she immediately noticed what had changed and what had remained exactly the same. The artwork was still in its place. The walnut floors still reflected the afternoon light. The city still stretched endlessly beyond the windows. Marcus walked toward the kitchen without saying a word and turned on the same faucet Naomi had repaired a year earlier. Clear water flowed smoothly before he shut it off. Silence followed. Not a single drop fell into the sink. Naomi smiled as she remembered standing in that very spot wearing rain-soaked shoes, convinced she had already ruined her only opportunity. Marcus leaned lightly against the counter. Do you know why I never replaced that faucet? Naomi shook her head. Because every morning it reminds me that leadership begins with noticing what everyone else ignores. He looked around the apartment before continuing. I used to believe the most valuable people were the smartest ones in the room. His voice remained calm, thoughtful. I was wrong. The most valuable people are the ones who care enough to act when nobody is watching. Naomi looked toward the quiet faucet, then out across the city where thousands of lights had already begun glowing as evening settled over Manhattan. My father used to tell me that if something small can be fixed today, leaving it for tomorrow only makes tomorrow heavier. Marcus nodded slowly. Your father was a wise man. As they prepared to leave for the dinner downstairs, Ethan suddenly ran back through the open apartment door, carrying the small wrench Marcus had framed inside a shadow box near the kitchen wall. You forgot this, he called excitedly before realizing it was mounted behind glass. Everyone laughed. Marcus gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. No, buddy. That stays right there. Ethan tilted his head. Why? Marcus looked at Naomi before answering. Because some tools repair pipes. He smiled warmly. And some remind us how to repair people. As the three of them stepped into the hallway together, the apartment behind them remained perfectly quiet. The faucet no longer leaked. The company no longer hid its problems. A little boy who once worried about his mother's next job now dreamed about becoming an engineer. And somewhere inside a building that had finally learned to value character as much as talent, one simple act of kindness continued creating ripples far beyond the single drop of water that had started it all.